I am going to start the recording right now. I'm recording the entire meetup and we'll post it on our website and the meetup page tomorrow, together with the slide deck. So I'm going to be sharing all the slides that I'll be showing today. I do encourage participation and questions and remarks and everything. So if you want to jump in, if you want to ask a question, you can either just unmute yourself and pop up and ask the question, or you can write it down in chat. I will pause at certain times to get to questions that we have. I think that was all about the meetup itself. Then on to a quick outline of the agenda. So we're going to start out with exploring like what's the relationship between agility and remote working? Like why are the two even connected? Isn't it? Aren't they supposed to be separate? Why are we talking about them in one sentence? Then we're going to be briefly looking back at like pre-COVID, how we used to do remote work in the past, followed by exploring like what are like the differences between remote working versus in person, which is mostly looking at why is in person so important, and what are like the downsides of remote working, followed by what will the future sort of hold, right? What are we doing right now? Why are we where we are at, and what's coming up? Followed up, wrapped up by like overcoming the challenges that people typically face, like and things what you can do, things that you can do to be effective at remote working and still be agile at the same time. And I do want to add a little bit of a disclaimer here. Some of this stuff is going to be like more generically about remote working, but the relationship to agile will be made clear like the first part. So anyway, without further ado, let's get started. Let's look at why we even mentioned these things in the same sentence. So very simply put, Agile was born out of co-located teams, right? It was sort of developed with teams in the same room, people being together, looking at those synergies and like solving a problem together. And that's sort of like rolled into the Agile Manifesto, because the Agile Manifesto itself even says that the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation, right? It doesn't say you must be physically located in the same room together, but it does have a very strong implication that yes, that has to be the case. It's much more effective to work in a team if you're sitting in the same room together. And that's really where agile and remote working start clashing a little bit, because if you're remote, if you're in a video conference, it's going to be different compared to being face to face. Agile also relies on very quick communication, effective, efficient communication, right? As it says in the manifesto. And you really don't have those synergies if you can spin your seat around and talk to the other person that's in your team, right? Or walk over to their desk, or talk to that stakeholder within your organization, or invite your customer over for a couple of sessions. Like that quick response time is basically gone, and that does impede to a certain degree agility. The same goes for these agile events, right? I already mentioned it, like inviting a stakeholder over, things like sprint reviews, things like sprint planning, even daily scrums, right? They're different when they're being done remotely. And part of that, in my opinion, is due to the tooling that's being used, right? And I'm not talking about Jira versus whatever other tool there is out there. I'm talking about like, do you use like a physical board, or do you use like other things like screens or charts? It's much more effective if you are huddled there together without having to do it all electronically. And that simply works better in person. There's a lot of agile teams out there that have stuff like they call them scrum boards or agile walls or war rooms or whatever, right? And the power of that extreme transparency is the fact that it just sort of hits you in the face. It's there, it's unquestionably there, like a billboard in Times Square, right? I mean, there's no way you're going to be able to ignore that Hershey sign. I mean, it just shines right at your face, and you simply don't have that if you're switching to electronic tooling. Not to say there's not a need for that, and that's not the point I'm trying to make, but it is much more effective if you're all doing that in person or and co-located. And then there's the final thing is like certain frameworks sort of require co-location. If and I know they've adapted, right? But if you look at SAFe, their PI planning, for example, the whole idea behind BI planning is getting that entire release train into the same room for 2 days, right? making sure that we look back and we look forward, and you have the flexibility of having that face-to-face communication, that quick turnaround, that all those synergies that you have when you put like that, those numbers in the same room. And like I said, I know we've all adapted, right? We're doing them virtually now, and I heard some of them are even back to doing them in person. But doing them virtually requires whole different measures and is half as effective as having people in the same room together. So as you see, there's a very strong case to say, yes, Agile is sort of tied to being in person, to face-to-face communication, to being co-located. Not to say you can't do it without it. You can definitely do it without it. There's a number of success stories even. Companies like GitLab are completely remote and they're pretty agile and they're very good at it. The only difference is that those companies, those organizations sort of were remote from the start and they didn't need to transform into it, which is what a lot of organizations are facing right now. So this is the relationship between agile and remote working. Like it implies that co-location is a requirement and there are certain things that simply work better and more effective when you're face to face. But then the situation started changing a little bit. So let's look at how things were before, because before that remote working wasn't something that really hit us at every corner. It does depend a little bit on your organization, but typically remote working was like sort of limited. It has always existed, obviously, because we have the luxury, we have the technology to be able to do it. In my experience, in our experience as an organization, it is quite rare that people work remotely all the time, right? It was like the occasional, I got to work from home day because I got to visit the vet, or I got like a sick kid, or things like that. Or some people had like one day remote working a week. But that was sort of like the gist of it. The exception there obviously is multinationals, but to a degree, I don't really consider that remote working in the sense of like everybody being in their own home. That was more like people being in different time zones and different offices, right? You have always had remote teams, right? Could be offshoring teams, could be outsourced teams, and tied into the multinationals, right? Again, much of what we're going to be talking about applies to that as well. Same for partially co-located teams, but it was still different from where we are at right now. But what was different before is that we could travel. We could just, in case it was needed, we could just hop in a plane and fly anywhere we wanted. And to a degree, maybe that's returning right now. I mean, it's getting a little bit more flexible, certain ways of traveling now that we've sort of got testing up and running properly. But it's far from where we used to be, right? You used to be able to book a ticket and jump on a plane to across the Atlantic, like within 24 hours. And that luxury is really sort of gone. And it's probably going to stay a little bit like that. And before, remote working was a choice, right? It was typically something that people said like, hey, I want to do this. I want to work from home. Yeah, I know my office is in New York, but I'm going to live in Phoenix, Arizona because I've got family there. I'm going to ask permission from my manager. I'm going to build my home office, et cetera, right? So that's like really people's choice. And obviously the circumstances were also that in-person was safe and easy to do. So there was not really necessity for it. And at the same time, it was easy to say to people like, hey, just come into the office and be there. Sheila, I'm going to get to your question in 1 second. I see you raise your hand. So there was always an alternative, right? It was always a choice in that sense. And that's like, for me, the big differentiator here. I'm going to pause here quickly, see if there's any questions. Sheila, you raised your hand.
Yes, you said that it's not as effective working remotely for things like PI planning.
Yeah, I did.
Do you have any empirical evidence for that, or is that just an assumption?
I do have empirical evidence for that. I have spoken to a number of SBCTs, so scope. What is it? Scope. That like the people that can train leading safe trainers, SBCs, and they have ran a number of sessions, and it turns out that you're going to miss a whole bunch of dependencies if you're not face to face together. First of all, you're going to be slower, right? But as a result of that, you're going to miss dependencies. You're going to not going to be able to plan everything you wanted to plan, and that's like the biggest downside of those remote planning sessions. But I also like to ask the group if there's anybody with experience there. Maybe you can chip in.
Now, I've talked to people that I know that have done some of that, and they've said it worked fine. But I
Okay.
wonder if it makes a difference what tools they used or whether it was right after the start of the pandemic, because what I've been seeing is the tools have improved remarkably over the last few months.
That's fair. That's fair. And I guess to a certain degree, I could go along with yes. It definitely depends on the tooling that you use. Yeah, but face to face, that communication, that really like being able to talk to people and see the synergies in a room and walk over to the other desk and like physically map everything out. The experience that we've had and that we've heard from our clients are that it does slow them down. But yeah, your mileage may vary. My opinion though is that it's very much less effective than when you do it in person.
I guess the other question I have that's related is, are you talking about teams that are normally co-located, or are you talking about teams that are geographically dispersed that wind up having to travel in order to do the PI planning face to face?
Definitely talking about teams that used to be co-located. Yes, that used to
Okay,
do PI planning in person. I agree. It's different if you're used to doing it virtually to begin with.
no, they weren't doing it virtually. They were physically traveling. I've done it myself where I've traveled for a PI planning, but then I'm not in an office that I know. I mean, I remember not being able to find a working printer and having no idea who to ask because I was in a strange location, but I was there for PI planning with people who worked in that office. And we were part of the same organization. We just weren't all co-located normally. We were literally in different cities. And I've talked to other people in that situation who had traveled previously. So I guess it's different challenges depending on the organizational structure, may be the question.
Yeah, I think I think that's a very good conclusion. And Samantha also wrote in chat. It depends on a number of participants and teams as well. And obviously, there's an experience component to this. If you've done like 50 PI plannings by now, I guess it's a lot easier to convert to virtual because you've got the habit of it. And if it's like your third PI planning and you suddenly got to switch to virtual, you haven't even got the hang of the first principles or got all of the experience. So it's uncharted territory. And to everyone else, as you can hear from Sheila and my conversation here, is that there's really a lot more proof, I guess, to be assembled for there to be any hard conclusion.
Hey, Martin, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So in our case, and in a fairly large organization, we've done quite a few big room type, big board, big room strings, PI planning, pre-COVID. And those sessions typically, would span 1 or 2 or 2.5 days, and were pretty, I don't want to say chaotic, but not kind of weren't very smooth. Okay. Now we were also at the beginning of a transformation, kind of moving into agile world. Once COVID hit though, and everybody went online, we built out a table in Confluence. Okay. And we kind of mimicked our blackboard. Okay. And every team, functional team, had kind of their own swim lane. And then every team would kind of talk through what their deliverables had been and what kind of dependencies they saw. And throughout the COVID year, what we found as a team, and I'm talking about maybe between 20 and 30 participants, is that these virtual PI planning exercises for us have been a lot more streamlined and productive, actually. And maybe it's just also a matter of maturity, but for us, it became a little bit more productive, a lot more streamlined, and not quite as chaotic as chasing some of the strings and things like that on the board.
Okay, yeah, I actually had a conversation on those strings this morning with somebody, and the chaos that it implies. Then again, my personal opinion, there's a power to it. But thank you for sharing that experience, and great to hear it's working for you. It's much more streamlined. So Kim, you have your hand raised as well.
Yeah, hi, this is Kim. We have been remote for, I want to say about a year now. We were all co-located. Our PI plannings were about 2.5 days. All our contractors, regardless of where they lived, would fly in. Now we're all remote. We did struggle in the beginning. We used Teams, um, and we use Mural for our board. Um, and just every release, we have program retros, and we find what is not working and we fix it. Like the latest thing we just made changes to was we're really good at identifying our dependencies outside of our department. But one of the things we found that we're struggling is putting a visual identification on that mural board of our internal dependencies.
Dependencies, right? Okay, okay. I do like the mention of that tooling, right? To Sheila's point before, tooling has gotten a long way. Things like Miro and Mural, why they pick those two names, they're too much alike. I don't know, but that really goes a long way in making this much more effective. George, go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of want to echo a statement that was made earlier about tooling and using templates. And for my organization, again, fairly large, we found that by having the proper tools and also templates to kind of onboard everyone's idea, onboard the idea of the fact that yes, we're switching to a virtual environment was a lot more effective. Now, in our case, what we did was we decided to break it up, meaning that you might have, say, a day or two PI planning where for lack of a better way of saying, put sticky notes up. All right.
Right.
We do it when we do first identify, okay, what are dependencies, but then once we realize that we break, we basically have a breakout in terms of, we will stop, we will cap it to 2 hours. We will break, and then we will reconvene the day after. On, say, we start on Monday, we reconvene on Wednesday, and that gives the owners time to chase down dependencies, get a little bit of clarification, and then we reconvene on Wednesday, and then we reconvene on Wednesday, same process. And then Thursday, now we're putting everything all together into our tool. So it is a bit of breaking this out, but I just found that it is kind of a breakout, chase down what you need as an owner, prepare, then watch, rinse, repeat.
And thanks for sharing that experience.
Yeah.
So you're basically spreading it out, right? You're saying
exactly.
Like we're not doing 2 days straight. We're building in that additional time and capacity so we can properly do these things.
Exactly. So,
all right.
Yep. Yeah, CBR 1, 2, 3. I just call them waves or sessions. Yeah. I mean, the fact is, the entire gist of PI planning is you're trying to uncover what you don't know, right? To begin with.
Exactly.
And yes, and I agree. In an office environment, you can just walk over to another team, bring them in as needed, but that's not going to happen. That's a little bit harder at times. So we just kind of spread it out, so that gives people a chance to chase down what they need.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And Samantha said that planning ahead of time is requires effort, but it does pay off. And I guess that's mostly to the point about effectiveness that I tried to make, is that it's very easy to adapt in like an in-person environment, and it's a lot harder to do that virtually. You can't just pull up like a blank mirror board and expect it to work, whereas in a real situation, those things are easier to do. So you are going to need a lot more preparation in order to do it virtually. But if you do that properly, it can work, definitely. And it's great to hear all these experiences of people doing it virtually now and having that experience ahead of time. So thank you for the great conversation. Oh, a final comment or maybe not final comment, a comment from Kim here. We also break it out now, so it's not a full 2 days any longer, a separate gathering for over a week. including guidance in the O team department and the right SMEs. So that's sort of like breaking those things apart and adding some time in between to organize everything. Very good suggestions and remarks here. All right, so let's go back to like as a follow-up on this conversation, like the differences between remote working and I got to click here and in person. This goes deeper onto the point a little bit before that I made. Why I honestly believe that in person is much more effective. Not to say that remote can't work and doesn't work. I mean, there's not a lot of choice right now. But remote working it can be very personal, right? And it depends a lot on the circumstances, whether it will work. As per the conversation just now, it has to do with things like preference, like your environment, like can you work from home effectively, what your family situation is. Obviously now with COVID, it's different than it used to be in the past because previously, if you used to work remotely, you probably didn't have your kids home. You probably didn't have your spouse home. Again, really depends on your circumstances, but we're kind of being forced now. Time zone, location also really ties into like whether it works for you, what kind of work you do. Certain jobs are easier to do and certain roles are easier to have when you're working remotely. I've worked with a number of developers over the past 2 years who love working remotely for the very simple reason that it allowed them more focus time. Then again, I've worked with product managers and product owners that were like, oh no, I don't want this because it's so hard to coordinate everything and stay in touch with my stakeholders. So the job has a role, location of the rest of your team, what the company allows and accepts, what's even possible from like, maybe you don't have the space, right? That's another thing. What's legally allowed? Some teams even need to be on premise. I've had teams work in certain departments within finance that really had to be in the office because of data security, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously there are certain ways around that right now. But again, so whether it works for you depends on a whole bunch of circumstances and your mileage may vary. But, and this is really the point that I want to make from a human and interaction perspective, it's face-to-face communication beats video conference, beats phone calls, beats chat, beats email. And in that order, I would say, right? I see things happening with teams if they switch from face-to-face to video conference. Step is even bigger from video conference to phone calls, right? Because you're no longer seeing each other. Like that part of face-to-face communication that still remains on video is of immense value because you can see how people move, how they behave, what their facial expressions is, where they are, whether they're focused, distracted, how they feel. You can sort of like still sort of sense the room, as I'd like to call it, if you're doing video conference, not as well as face-to-face, obviously, because people are still staring at the screen, but it's still there are still certain advantages there, and the further away you go, the less of the human face-to-face communication with all its nuances and additional information you can pick up sort of disappears, right? And this is why personally, and this is really a preference as well as an observation, really lean towards face-to-face communication because it's simply the richest form of communication, right? It allows for those better synergies. It enables a closer connection to the rest of the team. It's a lot easier to goof off, for example, or make jokes or have like impromptu conversations that can lead to whatever. It makes communication easier and quicker, right? I said it before. It's like, hey, you're just going to walk over to the desk. You're going to run into people at the coffee machine or in the hallway, or you're going to notice things that are going on at your coworker's desk and like be able to respond to it. It also makes Agile events so much easier because it's luck work. And I'm not sure what your experience all is, but what I've seen mostly at things like daily scrums, they tend to suffer the most from like video conferences because it really takes away from more like a natural conversation and people take turns because if somebody tries to jump in to the conversation, they sort of start talking over each other. Let me know if there's any experiences here. Face-to-face communication also reduces complexities, right? Delays, planning things that need to happen, frustration, coordination. It's not a natural thing yet for people to, not for everyone at the very least, to just hop on a call and be available like that, right? It usually requires some planning and some coordination, like you need to schedule something or you need to set something up. And as we do this for longer and longer, obviously it becomes more, it becomes easier and more common for us to do these things. But these complexities are something that we really have to adapt to. And I made this one before, right? So more natural contact moments, natural communication, like, hey, I see you're doing that thing, or I noticed this. Most importantly of all, and I think this is my biggest point of it, the biggest reason why I'm a huge fan of face-to-face communication, and preferably in person, is because it helps you create and maintain that organizational culture and mindset. What you don't see or hear, you don't know. If you don't get that, if you don't get surrounded by that culture, if you don't get surrounded by that mindset, it is incredibly easy to, first of all, maintain one, but especially your change one. I heard people are in an agile transformation. It is simply harder if you're doing it remotely. Nothing's impossible. And the longer we do this, the more we adapt to it. So we will overcome, even if the future is going to be all remote, we'll find ways, right? But still, there's that thing that we can do called in person that typically has a lot of advantages over remote work. So just go into the chat here and some of the comments here. So Kim says, I completely agree. We've been putting an emphasis on chat over emails and pushing folks to turn their cameras on during meetings. Yeah, and that's similar to what I've seen, and I'm sure others can echo that as well. Well, first of all, emails, like there's a lot of things, but it's also more asynchronous, I'd say, than even chat. But the thing with chat for me is, if it's Slack or Teams or whatever, it's still asynchronous, right? It's like text messages, WhatsApp messages, or whatever, iMessages, whatever you're using. You're sending something to someone, and it's up to them to pick a good time to respond. And this is typically where it goes wrong, because one person thinks it's like synchronous, right? So they're sending you a message and expecting you just to drop everything you're doing and responding to that message. And this is a great example of why I truly believe in being co-located. If you would be in the office together, you could see somebody sitting with their headphones on, being focused, and know now is not a good time to disrupt, right? So it will make it easier. And obviously that's where video conference comes in. So a great suggestion, a great comment, Kim. I appreciate that. Samantha echoes, I personally prefer in person. It makes the communication smoother and quicker instead of typing. That's another thing. I do want to quickly segue into a little bit of a something that I recently noticed online. There's a company called Automatic. They are like the creators of WordPress and all that, like, comes with that. And they are remote. They're a remote company right now. I'm sure they have like an office somewhere, but they're mostly remote right now. And their interview process is through Slack. It's that's their first interview. It's like a 90-minute conversation through Slack, because they rely on remote working so heavily, and Slack is their primary means of communication because they are remote, right? So because that's a primary means of communication, they're going to do the first interview through their primary means of communication. Very interesting. That I just want to leave that out there as a thought, right? But it was interesting to see that these things are being switched to as well. And to a degree, I mean, their argument makes sense. I agree with that, Samantha. It sounds not so automatic. Anyway, let's have a little bit of a look right at the situation that we are in right now, and possibly what the future might bring. And I have to add in a disclaimer here. What the future is going to bring is filled with assumptions and stuff we hear, and so it might be completely wrong, maybe hopefully wrong, I don't know. So the situation that we're all in right now is born out of necessity, right? COVID-19. We all know it. We've all been there. The fact that we're doing all these things like PI planning remotely is not because we choose to do so. It's because we have to, we are forced to do so. And I think that could be part of the driver why it works now, whereas it wasn't not nearly as effective in the past, because right now there's simply not another way. In the past, I've seen companies do it virtually because they didn't want to spend the money on flying people over, putting them in hotels or hiring conference rooms, right? Right now, it's sort of like, well, even if we have the money or want to spend it, we really can't, right? The other thing, obvious stuff here, right? Many offices are closed for long periods of time. Some are even closed indefinitely. Some will never reopen. I've heard people that have to be remote at least the rest of this year. I think was Facebook, Twitter, like Google, like those big names said like, well, we're probably not going to be all back into the office. And obviously being here in the New York area, lots of people ditching their very expensive real estate here in Manhattan because it doesn't make sense to have an office that nobody goes to. And with people sort of fleeing the city, and I guess the same goes for other locations inside the United States and across the planet. People that start moving around, so there's a chance they don't even want to come back, right? Because turns out that spending all that money on an apartment in Manhattan and then being stuck at home is not ideal for many. So I've heard people moving upstate, people moving to other states and trying to enjoy more like the spacious life. So yeah, it's either like out of the city or out of the state even. Many people have done that. So I guess that definitely plays part to what the future will hold. Yet for many others, it's a temporary measure, the situation we are in right now, right? So, and this is the tricky thing. It's like finding the balance between what are we going to do in the future and when will that turn around? Is it going to be this summer because we started vaccinating? Can we go back to the office, or is it going to like flip the other way, mutate, and we're going to be stuck with this for the next 4 hours? So it's like really like where are we at and what are we going to do? And I guess that sort of drives the immense effort to being virtual and making that work, because for all we know, we could be in the situation indefinitely. But at the same time, because we're being forced, remote working is often inconvenient. And this goes to a couple of slides back, right? Depending on your circumstances, working remotely is definitely not good. I was talking to two people over the weekend. They have a small apartment. They do have a 2-bedroom, but they only have space for one desk in there. And they have different jobs, different companies to sit at the same desk, feet bumping all day, right? People working from a studio apartment together, right? There's no way to close any doors, like other than the bathroom. So it's some people have their kids at home, and so that's a huge inconvenience. And hopefully in the future that if it's going to be permanent, that will go away. But then again, a lot of people do want to go back into the office. I also spoke to a number of people that have the luxury of still going into the office now, and they do it because not only does it work better for them, it's their preference because it helps them focus and all these other things, right? So quick sidestep before I move on to Kim's comment. I agree, in person is definitely my preferred means of communication. Now that we're permanently remote, we've had to get creative to mimic in person with our video cameras. So Kim, is yours one of the companies that has decided not to go back into the office for now or the foreseeable future? Not sure if you're still here, by the way. But if
Sorry
you
about
are
that.
here, you are.
Yeah, about 20% of the workforce is now permanently remote.
Wow. Okay. Makes sense. Thanks for clarifying that. And you also said we have seen our leadership of our company seeing the positives of remote work, where in the past they were completely against it. And that's the other side of this. In that extent, I used to have a coaching assignment with a large consulting firm here in New York, and they have been spending the past several years making sure that people were becoming more location agnostic. And so when COVID hit, they were working like they weren't working remotely, but they were working virtually. So their teams were like all over the planet. And now that COVID hit, it's like, damn, it was like easy for them. It's just adapting to the home circumstances. But the way they operated was a lot easier to get into. Mine is the travel and the being able to do things like PI planning and those workshops in person. Ming says stability of internet is another thing. It's no comparison to office internet, which is crucial for remote meetings. It does depend a little bit on where you are. I gotta admit that my gigabit Fios line is pretty awesome and no hiccups. But then again, if you live in a family home with 3 children and a spouse and everybody's working from home and streaming and whatnot, it's going to be a lot trickier, especially if you're not in like a major metropolitan area. I'm sure it's a challenge. And George says we've taken advantage of remote as we've always had colleagues teams in the UK or EU, right? So that makes a lot of sense. With the time saved from a commute, we've had a lot more time to connect during the day versus being compressed. So there's definitely some upsides there as well. And Ming just wanted to add the SLAs for ISPs are different between home and office. Yes, so are the prices. Awesome. So let's move on to working, remote working in the future. And this is just my opinion mixed with some assumptions and based on conversations that I've had, right? So huge, massive disclaimer there. I really think, and sort of the conversations we had here echoes that, is that remote working is here to stay, right? Kim just said at 20%, I've heard even 80%, right? I've heard a lot different numbers. And I guess we'll have to see what eventually happens based on what's possible. But it's gonna be different than it used to be before. Like that, everybody coming into the office every single day. I don't see that happening anytime soon. So I do think that the office of the future will likely be set up differently, especially for less occupation. And this has been a movement for the past decade where organizations have started introducing concepts like flex desks and sort of like slowly moving people out of the office, especially those that have roles that require them to travel in the first place. It's sort of like setting up those offices for the group meetings that we've always used to travel for, right? Those workshops, PI plannings, things like that. So that's part of what I heard and what I read. And there's a little bit of my skepticism. Will it work? So long as we're still dealing with the virus, flex desks are a hygienical nightmare because like who has sat there, you need to keep cleaning it. And there's a lot stronger case for your traditional cubicles and like fixed desks. So you can sort of like have the same pods and limited exposure. But then again, the back and forth, I'm not sure how people will adapt to that, like 3 days remote, 2 days at the office. I'm hearing all kinds of variations, and I'm very curious what it will be like. But it seems like we're at least heading to having part of the workforce be remote perpetually. And if you're part of the people that moved out to like a different place, you're no longer near your office. And I'm hearing more of that in the circle of people I talk to. There's not a lot of appetite. They bought a bigger house with like an office there, and they've ditched the commute, like has been mentioned, right? They're saving a ton of time. Spoke to somebody over the weekend that had a commute to Manhattan, like 1.5 hours each way. So on a good day. So you can do the math, right? It's going to save you a ton of time. So I do think that people are expected to work from home in those organizations that adapt to it, circumstances permitting. And this is where there's a lot of unknowns, I think, because it depends on a lot of the factors that we mentioned before. It's like, do you have a space? Do you have a family situation that permits it? Does it work for you personally? Does it work for your team? Does it work for your organization? So lots of unknowns there. And I think hybrid teams will definitely be a big part of this. And this is where I'm really curious myself. And with hybrid teams, I mean, like part of them are in the office and part of them are scattered. I've worked with those in the past, and my mileage really varied. Experiences have been very mixed. Certain teams were really good at it. Other teams had a situation where those teams that were physically co-located had a lot better synergy than the couple of people being remote. And I guess it sort of depends on how your organizations establishes it. So there are alternatives available. But yeah, what do people want? Do they want to go back into the office? That's the big question that remains. I guess there's only one way we are going to find out. So I'm going to pause here briefly for questions and read out Kim's comment. I had to get Verizon FiOS as a backup for the internet I had, and my son set it up so one internet provider drops, the other automatically kicks in. So, wow, that's like a really redundant solution you have there. But yeah, I agree with what you're saying. It's a struggle for a lot of folks. Not everybody is as blessed to have the position to either have like two lines or have something like FiOS, which offers incredible speeds both up and down. I'm not getting paid by Verizon, by the way. I wish. Maybe I should strike a deal with them. Anyway, so moving on. So really get into the gist of it. So overcoming challenges. So now that we're remote, here's a couple of things based on my experience, based on our experience as an organization with our clients. Like, what can you do to overcome those challenges? So the first one, and it might feel a little bit like an open door, but I can't emphasize this enough because I've seen it being broken down, is to rigorously stick to your meeting schedule for those standing meetings, right? And here I'm mostly talking Scrum events, Agile ceremonies, whatever you want to call it, right? Making sure you have them, you don't start moving them around, you get that cadence. That simplicity has always reduced complexities, and those habits, those anchors, are usually incredibly important for people to structure their day when they're remote. Over the conversations, I've done a lot of networking over the past couple of months, because no more conferences, right? So you do it via different ways, and a lot of people need a little bit of structure to their day. So having that rigorous schedule definitely helps in making that life easier and making sure you have those fixed moments of exposure with people. And something that I never put in, I didn't even put in here, right? But it goes to a point later on webcams, is making sure that you can see each other at these fixed times, right? That everybody's there, that everybody's present. It's not going to be like, oh, I got to be in this meeting, so I'm just going to sit here, but secretly work on my email. No, just be focused on those moments because they're incredibly important. Another great thing that I got introduced to recently, open environments for spontaneous conversations, right? So there's an app called, or a website, web application, whatever you want to call it, called Kumo Space. And it's sort of like a virtual space that you can jump into with your camera, microphone, and and you can physically move around the room by just using your mouse and keyboard. And if as you move around the room, what you hear changes. So you have like a couple of areas in there. So you got a table with seats, you got a couch and everything. So when you move over to the couch and there's somebody else, you can talk to that person, and you're not going to be able to hear the conversation that's going on at the table. But if you move away from the couch, like in the app, and over to the table, you're going to be losing the sound of the guy on the couch or the girl on the couch, and you're going to be hearing the conversation at the table. So it's really like you're physically moving around in the same room, yet it's all virtual. And having that sort of luxury or that sort of availability of people in that room, that makes a huge difference if you're working remotely, and really allows for that water cooler talk. The only thing is you can't secretly talk about your manager and have a look around if they're secretly coming around the corner. But other than that, it really allows for great conversations. Kim just posted a link in here in the chat. I will also be posting that tomorrow. So that's a great addition there. George Seconds is sticking to a schedule. This extends to the earlier statement of preparation and planning, right? Discipline is the key to keeping accountability and making meetings meaningful. And I guess that was that used to apply before as well. But if you're doing it in person, you can easily get away with considerably less planning. Whereas if you're doing it virtually, you have to be prepared. You simply can't wing it. Comment from Amin here. He says, even heard we now have some campers and working remotely, basically traveling around camping and working from their vehicle. Surprisingly, they get a stable connection. That is excellent. I'm not sure if they travel around the Rocky Mountains. Not a lot of reception there, but it's yeah, the options are endless. And if you have that flexibility right now, who's stopping you? So another major recommendation from my end is ensuring team accessibility, and you really need transparent communication for this. And what I mean with that is you want to make sure that if you're working, if you're available, you're going to be making that known to people. So you could use like the subtle things like in tools like the statuses in Slack or Teams, or hey, I'm busy right now, I'm available. But also like just simply letting people know like, hey, I'm going to be stepping away from my desk for an hour. So I'm not going to be available. Just call me on the phone if it's like super urgent, or not even that, or just saying like, hey, my work days are sort of like from this to this. And to a degree it reduces the flexibility of working remotely, but the obvious benefit is that it makes it a lot easier to have those spontaneous communications, to have the ability for others to reach out to you and say, hey, want to hop on a call real quick, I got like a question I got to ask you. It's sort of like looking over at the desk and saying like, hey, he's available. You can sort of mimic that virtually easily, but it requires a lot of discipline, like I said before. But it also requires trust, right? Because if there's not a basis of trust, how comfortable are you going to be at 11 a.m. saying, hey, I'm going to be stepping away from my desk for an hour, and people not having an opinion about it, being like, whatever, probably going to go grocery shopping, and just being fine with it, right? Because there's the flexibility you have working from home to do those things, right? So it requires some adaptation, but if that trust is there, that works really, really well. The next one, and this is, I made this bold because I think this is the most important one, like webcams on. We have a client, and I had to teach a class there a couple of weeks ago, and they saved $30 on each laptop that they purchased over the past 2-3 years by leaving the webcam out. And now, in a time where webcams are very scarce, I guess the cheaper cameras are much more available, and I'm seeing stock go up, but they have to buy webcams for all of their employees at like double, triple the cost, maybe even more than that, because they need to ship them out there. So that's really a huge pain. But the webcam adds a lot, right? Being able to see each other, being able to sense all these things. I said it before, right? And there can be some initial resistance against people switching on their webcams. Some people don't like to show their homes or have other people working there, et cetera, et cetera. And tooling adapts, right? So you have like virtual backgrounds. You can even like have the background fade away so you don't see a lot of detail, but it's like blurry. So thankfully, all the tooling we use adapts very, very well to that. But again, webcams on as much as you can, right? You can have a bad hair day. But if you have a bad hair day every day, I mean, you better fix that then so you can appear on camera again. I literally had that conversation with someone. Following up on that, like invest in the proper equipment, not just a good camera and a headset and things like that. That's the obvious stuff, right? But a good place to work, like a good chair, comfortable chair, maybe even a good keyboard, a good mouse. Like I know people that just like sit hunched over their laptop like all day long, and it's at one point it's not going to be good enough, right? People in the office typically have like an external monitor that they can hook it up to, like a proper keyboard, et cetera, a proper chair, a desk with enough space on it. So obviously the challenge here is like, who's going to pay for it? The office is going to be your boss paying for it, obviously. And to the limited number of people that I spoke to about this have sensed some resistance from their organizations into investing in this, especially because there's a huge degree of uncertainty involved, obviously. But it's incredibly important to have a proper setup. And this goes to Ming's point about internet. I'm just reading about 5G here, that's definitely going to provide a solution for if you want to drive around your camper van and work remotely. Next thing is going to be that people all have to be very mindful of the fact that you are remote. It's going to be different from in person, right? We have to, regardless of what your opinion, your preference, or whatever is, right? We have to recognize that being remote is simply different from in person. And just an understanding and maybe even compassion to others creates better teams, right? I had a situation with somebody not showing up on camera, et cetera, et cetera. Like they didn't participate in meetings, they were not responding, and just the very simple conversation. It took us a little bit to establish that trust, right? But just a very simple conversation of explaining that person's circumstances, why they were not on camera, what their circumstances at home were, et cetera, within that circle of trust within the team made a ton of difference, right? There was understanding, there was compassion, and people even started coming up with creative solutions to help that person out, and what worked out for the better. But for that to happen, you have to recognize that it's different, and you want to have that conversation within your team. And moving towards the future, right? Even if remote's going to be the next big thing, and we have remote teams as well that work for many of our clients in Europe, and the basic rule has always been like they meet at least once every quarter, no matter who flies where, right? Depends on what's easier. But the same goes for if we're going to be working remotely forever. You do want to have to see each other every now and then, and do get that exposure, even if it's just for like a company retreat and have a little fun as a team, or for workshops or planning sessions, or just to get that exposure and get that more human connection. And I heard from some teams that are even doing it on a more regular basis, like they have like an office day every other week where they get into the office, like safety, health, whatever measures permitting, obviously. So quick comment here from Kim, sharing an experience. We've had to learn to be patient with our coworkers who have kids at home, kids making noise, dogs bark. It's going to happen, and we have to be understanding. And I'm happy to say that I also have like a lot of understanding people that I've spoken to. I've spoken to people who have had kids, and I have a dog myself. She's not here right now, but like sometimes she has to be here during meetings because like my wife has got stuff to do as well. And the longer we're in this, and now that we're all used to it, it's like people simply are more accepting of it. And that's to the first point, right? Be mindful of it, create understanding. If you start a meeting, say, hey, my dog's here, my kids are going to be there, so I'm going to mute myself, so there's going to be a lot of noise here. So yeah. George is probably making an excellent point here. I would be curious, or a question, if anyone in here with a strategy management background has done cost benefit for the organization, paying for equipment versus price per foot per person office space against productivity and utilization. That's a lot of words in one sentence. Is there anybody that can speak to that? Please let it be known in chat, and we can pick that up in just a little bit, keeping an eye on the time here. Moving on, again, this has been addressed, but find the tooling that suits your team's need and don't settle for what you have. So the Agile Manifesto is clear about this, individuals and interactions over processes and tools, right? So whatever processes and tools you have should serve what the team is trying to do. And you shouldn't be adapting what the team is trying to do and how you work to the tooling just because that's the limitation, right? And I know at one point you're going to have to find some middle ground here, but running API planning, for example, with Jira versus using Miro boards, huge difference, really a huge difference. Know your backlogs in Jira, right? But Miro is a collaboration tool. Jira is a ticket system, right? Massive difference. And so you really want to be mindful of that. Agility requires more investment remote. Again, this is to the discipline that was mentioned before. Like you really have to invest time in that, in the preparations. It's easy to be complacent, right? And just like roll into meetings, but it's different now. So you really have to prepare. And finally, be aware of silos, right? So something that, this is a risk that I'm talking about. I'm not saying this necessarily happens a lot, but it's very easy for people to go solo or be disconnected for others, or teams to be disconnected for others, right? I know a lot of focus has also been on like, how does it work within a single team or department, but it's also across that, right? There's a wider organization. And over the past decade, we've all been trying to break down those silos to make it easier to go across the organization, right? Because value flows horizontally and silos are vertically, right? So we've been trying to break down all those barriers. And it would be a huge shame if that, because we're remote right now, we're going to go back just simply because of the fact that we are remote. So we have to be really mindful about that. All right, so that does conclude most of the meetup for today. So I just want to read out Ming's response to George, I think. He heard of a large tech company saved 500 million last year because employees work from home. Sounds about right, depending on where your office is. Companies like Deutsche Bank will have like huge offices here in New York. I think they can easily save millions and millions of dollars by closing it down, right? And then if that's the number, 500 million, not sure how many people work in a tech company. But I guess even if you have like 10 million employees, there's 100K. Well, look at your savings. That's like quick math, $5,000 a person. That buys you a very good home office, and then there's a lot left for the organization, I'd say. And so, well, George, there's one answer to your question. Awesome. Thank you for your contribution. So in general, thank you for being here. Thank you for all your contributions and conversations. Absolutely excellent. The next meetup is going to be March 17th, and I'm going to be an introduction to Scrum, focusing on the Scrum Guide 2020. So introduction to Scrum 2020 and 2021. So the new Scrum Guide is out since November, and most organizations have adapted their assessments as well. And there's some new stuff in there and a couple of minor changes. So I'm going to be going over like, how does it work? Could be a good go back, like getting that repetition again. But we're also going to be zooming in on those new things, like those commitments that got added in right to the attributes. So it's up on meetup.com, and you can RSVP to that one if you want to be there. Another heads up, if you do want to attend a professional Scrum Master, professional Scrum Product Owner class to get your certification, we have some come up in March and April with special pricing for those sessions in March. The coupon code, like to knock off something from the early bird pricing, doesn't apply to the special pricing, but in case you want to go to a class, feel free to share this with people that you know that want to attend a class, right? It's all good with me. Some contact information in case you do want to reach out. So thank you for being here. Feel free to stick around if you have any questions. If not, I hope you have a very great evening. So Amin, you're asking any URL to point out major changes in the Scrum Guide. If I do have a presentation available for that. If you go to the Meetup page and go back to the session of November, there's a link to the slide deck. There's a slide in there with all the changes listed, all the major changes listed. Thanks all. Have a good night.
Thanks, Martin. Have a good night.
Thanks. Have
Are
a
you
good
going to
one.
be posting the chat as well?